welcome, and thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss U.S. sanctions against human rights abusers around the world with special guest Monica Ager Jacobsen, Attorney Advisor at the U.S. State Department. Monica has played a crucial role in over 200 sanctions against human rights abusers around the world. She was recognized as a finalist in the 2020 Service to America Medals as an emerging leader in the State Department. And thank you so much for joining us today, Monica. We're so glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited about it.
We're also pleased to be joined by Irina Karmanova. She's joining us via audio at the State Department's Office of Public Liaison, and she was instrumental in making today's discussion possible. So thank you, Irina.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. My name is Irina Karmanova. I work in the Office of Public Liaison in the Department of State's Bureau of Global Public Affairs. My office conducts outreach to domestic audiences by connecting the Department of State to the American public, and we facilitate ways for domestic audiences to learn more about U.S. foreign policy issues and priorities. This conversation is part of our ongoing efforts to increase our outreach to World Affairs Councils across the country. And we are so excited to have Monica Jacobsen with us today. She's an excellent speaker and is an attorney advisor in the Office of the Legal Advisor in the Department of State. And so just a reminder, this conversation is off the record, and I'll let you take it away.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Irina. Thank you for making this possible. And as a brief intro, my name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the Council. Today, we also have a special opportunity. We have a Young Professional Roundtable, which will kick off at the conclusion of the webinar portion at 12:30. So for those of you participating today, please just stay on the line at the conclusion of the discussion, and we'll have more instructions on how to join to follow. So thank you again, Monica. Thank you, Irina. And I'd love to just dive in and kick it off. So Monica, can you introduce us briefly to your role in the State Department and what you're working on right now?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Amanda, for hosting, and I'm just honored to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you. As mentioned, I'm Monica Ager Jacobsen, and I'm an attorney advisor in the Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor, which is colloquially known as L, lovingly called L. And the structure of the office is pretty similar to the Foreign Service in that we rotate every few years. And so for about the last 4 years, I've been in the Human Rights and Refugees Office, where I've focused on atrocities and human rights related sanctions, which we'll talk about today, as well as disability rights, children's rights, and human rights related assistance restrictions. So happy to touch on any of those pieces as well. In the Department of State, I would say that lawyers simultaneously wear several hats. But generally, we serve as independent, nonpartisan experts on international law with wide-ranging remit across the department's entire workload. And a point that our former legal advisor, Harold Coe, once made, who's formerly the Dean of Yale Law School, is that it's really important to have L in at the takeoff of any new foreign policy episode to make sure that there's both the legal and political legitimacy of any actions that follow. And with that, clients need to be able to turn to their attorneys and say, what tools do I have in my toolbox to address any situations that they might be facing in foreign policy and foreign affairs? And so for me, for the luck of me coming to my current portfolio a few weeks before the Global Magnitsky Act, we call it, again, we like our short names at State, we call it GLOMAG, before GLOMAG was passed by Congress and enacted into law. I've been able to be involved in the process of setting up that program, the sanctions program, which focuses on targeting those who are engaged in corruption or human rights abuses abroad, and figure out what the scope of the program should look like, work through how we would select different targets or the people who are going to be facing sanctions consequences, and the messaging that would accompany every group of sanctions that we roll out. So I'm happy to talk through some of those decisions today. I can't talk about classified things or deliberative pieces, but there's still a lot we can talk about, and the very public nature of these sanctions. And I do think that Global Magnitsky is a great example of a tool with the US government working together, different agencies, including Treasury, sometimes the Commerce Department, State, Department of Justice, to implement a tool to address a foreign policy problem. And in this case, the problem is age-old and intractable, which is to say there are bad actors overseas that are committing really serious, egregious harms that we would consider human rights abuses. And we want to be able to say, we see what you're doing, we think that it's wrong, and we want to be able to take tangible and meaningful action against you as a individual or as a government entity to create consequences. And I can talk a little bit about why GLOMAG is unique. We didn't have a tool like this in our toolbox before. We had country-specific programs for places where there were really egregious harms like the DPRK in Iran, but the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program allows us to sanction people worldwide. So it's not country-specific, and anywhere in the world it can be utilized. And I can also talk a little bit about, and just to flag for folks who might not be as familiar with what sanctions are, but financial sanctions mean that the property and interest, so all of the money and any of the assets that a person has within the US jurisdiction are frozen. And so it can have real financial teeth to create serious implications for somebody who is sanctioned or for others who would want to interact with that person. So I think that's important to know, along with the fact that we are very public about these sanctions. And so there is this very public act of saying that the US has identified a person as a human rights abuser, and we care about what is happening in whatever part of the world the sanction relates to, that can have a deterrent effect, and it can also motivate foreign countries to take actions to hold those individuals accountable. So with that, I'm happy to have the discussion. That's my backdrop on both me and the GLOMAG program, and I'm happy to hear people's thoughts and questions and have a conversation with Amanda.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for outlining that too, because the Global Magnitsky Act, as I was reading about it, is revolutionary and does open up so many new avenues to really precisely target global human rights abusers in a way that wasn't possible before. So I know we're going to get into that. And before we do, I promise we won't ask too many pressing questions about the classified cases. But in your career, you've been involved in sanctioning 198 individuals and entities as human rights abusers. And I know you were mentioning your portfolio also includes cases involving atrocities, children, disability rights around the world. Can you share a particular case that really stands out to you that you've worked on and where you've seen sanctions be particularly effective?
Absolutely. And I think we're actually over 200 now, because we just did another group of human rights abusers in China in the Shenzhen situation earlier this summer in July. So we're over 200, and I'm proud of that too. But I think for me, you did mention, and I had mentioned earlier, that atrocities are another part of my portfolio that that has some sanctions related work, but those aspects of the work that I've been doing really overlapped and came together in a really meaningful way on the designations that we've done in Burma. Former Secretary Tillerson made a very public announcement that the situation in Burma constituted ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya, which is a Muslim minority group that lives in the northern Rakhine state, and now has over 1 million refugees that have been, through violence and abuses, pushed into Bangladesh in very bad situation. And so figuring out what we could do to call attention to that situation, to set up tangible consequences for those who are involved in the violence and the ethnic cleansing. It's hard because, people think that, when we see these issues in the world, we're just gonna, send in the troops or figure out some way to kind of stop it. And it's not quite as easy. These are really complex problems happening quite far away, and figuring out how to engage in ways that can really stem some of that violence, but not, not have other implications that are unintended is really hard. So in this case, we had gone through the process of determining that ethnic cleansing had taken place, and we identified several of the most responsible individuals. So those who were the heads of the military sections that had committed this ethnic cleansing, and we sanctioned them. And I think it was a really meaningful step for several reasons. One, there hasn't really been much of an accountability process. There's currently a case that's at the ICJ that's actually brought by the Gambia because they're both parties to the Genocide Convention. But that's still ongoing, and within Burma and in other places, there hasn't been much accountability. So to have the US stand up and say, we identify this as ethnic cleansing, and we're taking this action that will bar these individuals from interacting with the US markets or coming to the United States, and that there needs to be accountability for what has happened here, was just, I think, really important. And underlying all of those decisions, I personally, along with all the others who worked on it in different agencies as well as state, read horrific information about the atrocities that were taking place, the killings, the rapes, all of these just really atrocious acts. And so feeling like there was a means to stand up and say this was not right was really valuable for me personally, and I think had important consequences for victims as well.
Thank you so much. And that ties directly into a question we just got, specifically about consequences. And when we're talking about individuals that, might be operating outside of systems, we have a question in from Jack that says, can you describe the immediate effects that being sanctioned has on these individuals, on these perpetrators? Like how often are, example of a warlord or a terrorist leader in this operation actually using the US banking system? And what tangible consequences do they feel as a result of these sanctions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think I want to answer the question both in terms of the kind of legal piece, which is to say, so they can't interact with US markets. All of the property that they have or money that they have in US banks is frozen, so it can't be touched or accessed. And if people want to do business with them, they face their own consequences. As a practical matter, and I think this goes to show what a novel program this was in setting it up for being a global human rights program. Human rights abusers, unlike, say, corrupt actors, which are also targeted by the act, don't always have a ton of money. They're not always, rich oligarchs that are using this oil to exploit people or do bad acts. Sometimes they are warlords, somewhere far away without much connection to the US government. And this does also, again, have visa consequences. So for individuals who are subject to sanctions, US law or US executive orders mean that they can't enter the United States. They'd be denied a visa as well. But lots of times they're also not traveling to the United States. So to kind of think about and mentally process, even though it might not have the same financial consequences that it would have for a rich oligarch or a big company that is really reliant on the US systems or are interacting with it quite regularly, that there's still both messaging component that's really important, and also just the idea, people pay attention, I think, when the US stands up and is willing to say, we have credible information that this individual or this entity is committing human rights violations or abuses. And so for some of these human rights abuse cases, the financial implications might not be quite as serious on a personal level for them as some of the other cases where sanctions have been enacted previously. But the messaging is really amplified from if the State Department simply made a statement that we have concerns about XYZ person or area. And so I don't think that should be undervalued. And I think we've had a little bit of a mental reset with our sanctions programs about how to measure the success of sanctions as opposed to just quantifying how many assets we're freezing or blocking. And I should say, and Amanda, tell me if I'm going on too long on this, to create the Global Magnitsky Program, we implement it through an executive order. And one of the things I think we didn't, that doesn't get much focus because we talk about the individual sanctions quite a bit, is that to create this order to implement the act, the president declared that there was a national emergency related to human rights abuse and corruption. So it's the idea that human rights abuse and corruption threaten the stability of international political and economic systems wherever they take place. And so that idea is what's underpinning the program, and I think underpinning each of the individual sanctions decisions. And it's a pretty momentous statement that I'm very proud that the US government has made, because it recognizes that even though it may not touch us financially directly, this overarching idea that human rights abuses other places can have an impact on the United States, not just on our policy and politics, but on our economy, and that we're taking action to address that.
Thank you. When we talk about the individual abuses that you're investigating and litigating, in terms of the process in your office of the legal burden, what circumstances would rise to the level? I know I believe the line in the Global Magnitsky Act is a serious abuse of human rights. What circumstances would rise to that level to the point where actors can be sanctioned? And can you maybe give us an example of a time when a sanction was warranted and when it didn't rise to that level and you were unable to prosecute?
Sure. And I think we gave ourselves, so in implementing the act, serious human rights abuse is not a term that's defined in law. So there's a lot of flexibility. And so I get to spend a lot of time trying to sort through with our understandings and obligations under international human rights law, what constitutes a serious human rights abuse. And one of the things that I think is most important to note is that both state actors and non-state actors can commit serious human rights abuses. So Global Magnitsky has targeted both, and I think that can have a really meaningful impact. It might be a country where we actually have very friendly relations and think that they're doing a great job, but they have bad actors within them, and we want to help them in terms of creating consequences for a non-state actor that's disrupting the system through corruption or human rights abuse. And so we have an ability to take action there. I mean, I think in terms of situations that don't rise to serious human rights abuse, I mean, we think there has to be some reasonable distinction between a bad act that we don't like and a serious human rights abuse. And so being able to pin down that difference, and I think some of the hardest cases that come up are detentions in my mind, because when we're trying to sort through information about why a person has been detained, on what basis, what the laws are that allow them to be detained, and whether or not those laws are facially valid, and then whether or not they would be problematic either as applied under human rights law, those can be really complex cases. And a lot of times it'll just come down to what information do we know and what assessments can the policy offices, my clients, reasonably make based on the information that we have. Sanctions are administrative actions. They're not punitive. They're not punishment. And they do have to, if challenged, stand up in a court of law. So we in the legal advisor's office are really rigorous when we're looking at these packages to ensure that we have a legal justification for saying, even with a term that's not defined, like serious human rights abuse, that this would meet the standard. And so I think that it can be that we have a situation where everybody knows that this is a bad person, but in terms of finding credible sources that connect that person to these bad acts, we just don't have the evidence. And so, I've talked with, over time, lots of NGOs that work on inputting these cases, with folks within the department who are working to identify good targets. And I say, if you have the target, you can either find the information related to a situation and figure out which targets make sense from that. So if you want to deal with Burma and ethnic cleansing, you can look at the situation and see which names keep coming up in sources, for example. Or you can start with the names and then we can see what we have and whether it's enough to build a package.
Thank you. Thank you. Because the complexities behind, when we're allowed to act and when we're not are really interesting. And I know there's a lot of factors involved there. So you mentioned the detention centers and how those can be particularly challenging. we have an audience question in, and I know we wanted to make sure that we addressed detention centers in China and how they're affecting the Uyghur population. I know this is a priority. It's in the news, and a lot of us have seen some of the footage and heard some of the stories. Without getting into any of the classified territory, can you share with us what the U.S. position is on this situation in particular, and what you, if anything, you might be working on right now to address this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that the department, because I'm also working on these other human rights issues outside of the sanctions context, it's something that I can say the department is very seized of at the moment. I think Secretary Pompeo called it the stain of the century, what's happening with the human rights abuse crisis in Xinjiang. And it's really horrendous, the reports that are coming out, including recent reports related to forced abortions and forced sterilizations. But I am also very proud to say that we recently put forward several designations related to the human rights abuse that are happening in Xinjiang. So earlier in July, we had one set of sanctions that were rolled out. And then later in the month had several more. And I think identifying both entities that were involved in the detention as well as some of the individuals that are overseeing the detention centers and the detention framework for Xinjiang. So I think it's a little bit kind of wait and see to see what the implications of those sanctions are, because the Chinese system is certainly quite intertwined, as to the previous question about, some warlord who's out in the jungle may not care. I think with China, the implications are pretty significant right away. And I should also say, it's not all that common that, although it has happened in time with Russia and now with China, that US officials are sanctioned under their laws. So China did have a very reactionary position where they have sanctioned several government officials and an entity, including a Department of State official, our Ambassador for Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, under Chinese laws as retaliation, in their words, for those sanctions. So that's been interesting to see that play out, just because obviously the basis for those designations were serious human rights abuse, which are incredibly egregious. And to see what their government-wide reaction to it was, which was very defensive, has been interesting.
Thank you. And I know we're getting close to our time, and I want to combine a couple audience questions here to make sure that as we discuss global human rights, we would be remiss not to talk about what's happening in the U.S. and U.S. policy itself. So as we've seen some reports, that are troubling from Human Rights Watch in regards to human rights within the U.S., how has this impacted your work in promoting justice and human rights around the world? And do you see any reactions from other nations regarding the moral authority of the U.S. to sanction either them as a nation or their citizens?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I do think my role as a lawyer is to make sure that we are not holding other countries to a standard that we are not holding ourselves to. So in terms of understanding what our international human rights obligations and commitments are under international law, and not saying then that China or Burma or any other country should be held to a different standard. And that, again, this idea that these people are bad people does not necessarily translate to the idea that they're violating or abusing human rights or implicating international human rights law. And I think we need to be careful about that, because if we have a message on one hand that these bad acts are happening overseas, but there's something that we're not addressing in a real way at home, we do open ourselves up to criticism. And the impact of our sanctions, including but not limited to this very important messaging aspect of it that I've talked about for human rights abuse and the human rights abuse crisis that's happening worldwide. It undermines the effectiveness of the sanctions, and it undermines the messaging when there is really important work to be done to address these problems. So I think the role that I play in that is, again, reminding people that we have our understanding of what human rights law applies here, and we're not going beyond that. We're not trying to create new and higher standards for other countries, but we're trying to reflect back on the standards we hold ourselves to and apply and make sure that others are being held to those standards as well. But there's certainly a lot of work to be done, and I think it's a conversation that it just goes to show how important it is to have that conversation at every facet of the government, because actions being taken by domestically can impact our foreign policy and impact the foreign policy discussion. And so those are all interrelated.
Thank you. And another very high profile news story that you worked on, and this is pulling in a question from the audience. So in the example of Jamal Khashoggi, what was the hardest part about crafting sanctions against high-ranking officials of one of the U.S.'s allies, Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. It's interesting because I've thought in preparing for this, I've also thought about generally what the part that's the hardest about this is and most frustrating. And it is, we are the government, and so things move slowly. The Burma designations or China designations, those are things that have been ongoing situations. And now we are here several months and in some cases years later taking action. In Khashoggi, the hardest part was really how quickly we reacted. So when we heard about the disappearance, which was later understood to be a killing, we really wanted to take fast action. So this kind of rigorous assessment of who is responsible, who fits within these categories was, I think, the hardest part from my perspective, because you want to get it right, and particularly when you're dealing with a country where you're sanctioning government officials of a ally, you want to make sure that you're getting it right. So I think that was the hardest part there, but feeling like we had a tool in our toolbox that could allow us to react quickly and very publicly, lay out our concerns related to the situation was great to have. And I can't imagine what we would have done. I mean, we took visa actions as well, which we would have had previously, but thinking even before 2016, the tools in our toolbox were a lot more limited. And so I was very appreciative to have GOMAG as an option to provide to our clients at that juncture.
Excellent. And I know we are closely approaching our time limit. So just in our final question, you are working, the cases that come across your desk every day are bleak. I'm imagining they're very hard to get through. And in some cases, you're reading about some of the worst things that are happening around the world. In that context and doing the work that you do every day, can you give us an example or just tell us what gives you hope in this moment about the trajectory of our world and the systems and institutions within it?
Absolutely. It's hard. I mean, and I think a lot of the work that I do is, trying to make these judgment calls or legal assessments about really horrific things that are happening to people overseas, to sometimes at a mass scale, and just diving into those details, it really does take your breath away. And for me, I mean, I think I try to remember that behind those numbers and those very gruesome atrocities, there are real humans that were impacted by this. And that, I'm very glad that I'm part of this process that allows the US government to stand up for what's right, and be vocal about our support for human rights, and working to, deter human rights abuse, to ensure that other countries work to hold these people accountable. And so I try to keep that in the back of my head, because there are days where you just can't believe, especially because I don't have a regional focus. I'll go from looking at atrocities that are happening in Asia, and then all of a sudden I'm moving to Latin America, and it looks like lots of the acts are the same in a completely different context, in a completely different situation with completely different actors. And it can be disheartening, but if I'm going to be reading about those, I'm happy to be part of something that provides us at least a little bit of a solution in how to try to move forward and change the conversation and change the dynamic. So thank you for the question, though. It's hard. And it's hard for the other people I know working on it. And I'm so appreciative to them. The people who are working on the government and these issues are some of the most passionate people I have seen, who really want to be advocates for for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And I'm very appreciative to have them as a colleague to help me keep everything in perspective too.
Thank you. And we're so appreciative of you for the work that you do and also for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you to everybody who joined in today on Facebook, on Zoom. As always, we'll have this available for you to check out later if you want to revisit this conversation. Monica, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. It was really great talking with you
I
today.
really appreciate it. This has been wonderful, and it's just great to engage in this conversation and that folks are interested in the work that we're doing, and to have that dialogue. I really appreciate you setting this up, and I'm honored to have had the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, I will close us out then, and until next time, thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.